The first thing I remember is the smell burnt wiring and cold coffee. I was halfway through a cigarette when the primary channel went dead. Not static, not interference. Dead. The screens didn't blink, alarms didn't scream. They just stopped. Every set of eyes in that room turned toward me like I had the answer. I didn't. The teletype hammered out 3 half lines before jamming. Someone swore under their breath. Another lit a match, hands shaking just enough to notice. 14 minutes. That's how long the ocean went dark on us. And in that kind of darkness, you start to wonder if you'll be the one blamed for it. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from. And what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. Norfolk Naval Station. October 1978. Night watch. Level 3 communications room. The hum of the consoles had its own rhythm, a background noise you stopped noticing. After a few years, that night, it was the only sound left. No chatter, no overlapping reports, no updates from the Atlantic. Just the dull throb of fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of the air ducts overhead. I was on the far side of the room, leaning against the bulkhead with a clipboard that hadn't been touched in 20 minutes. The junior tech across from me had his headset tilted, one hand cupping the earpiece like he was trying to hear a confession. Nothing came through. His eyes met mine, the silent question hanging in the stale air. You getting this too? When you're in communications, silence is never neutral. It's either the prelude to an all clear or the first step into something you're not trained to handle. We ran the standard diagnostics loopback checks, antenna pings, alternate, frequency sweeps. Every test came back clean, which meant the submarine wasn't answering because it couldn't or wouldn't. I reached for the auxiliary receiver, an old piece of gear they kept around because it worked when newer systems didn't. Still nothing. Not even the faint hiss of ocean static. The junior tech began tapping his pencil against the desk, steady at first, then faster. I didn't tell him to stop. The sound was a reminder that we hadn't gone deaf. 2 supervisors stepped in from the adjoining office, their ties already loosened like they'd been pulled out of bed. One went straight for the main terminal. The other stood behind me, close enough that I could smell the bitter mix of aftershave and nicotine. Line status? He asked. I told him exactly what he already knew. No signal, no error codes, no explanation. We switched to backup channels. Relays through shore-based antennas, even a low-frequency link that could punch through storms. Nothing. The Atlantic had swallowed the USS Bastion whole. At the 7-minute mark, someone in the far corner started jotting notes into the incident log. Halfway through the second line, his pen snapped clean in the middle. He stared at the broken halves like they'd betrayed him. I told him to keep writing anyway. The junior tech adjusted his headset again and froze. I've got something, he said. Every head turned. A burst of sound came through, garbled, mechanical, impossible to pin down. It lasted 3 seconds, then vanished. The room stayed still, like movement might scare it off if it came back. We played the recording back 3 times. It wasn't Morse. It wasn't voice. More like metal grinding underwater, but with a rhythm that didn't feel accidental. One of the supervisors muttered that it was probably interference. I'd heard interference. This wasn't it. 9 minutes in, the commander on duty stepped inside. He didn't ask for a status update. He read it off the faces in the room. His presence shifted the air. Orders got shorter. Questions stopped. Someone killed the cigarette in the ashtray by the door. By the 12th minute, I'd memorized the position of every hand on every clock. One sat 2 minutes slow, the kind of detail your mind grabs when it's got nothing else to hold on to. I kept looking at it, wondering if those 2 minutes could change the story we'd end up telling, if we were allowed to tell it at all. Then, without warning, the console lit up. The submarine's ID reappeared in the system as though it had never left. The comms line was crystal clear. The junior tech exhaled, a sound almost as loud as the static had been. A voice came through calm, measured, REPORTING position and status, as if the last 14 minutes hadn't existed. We didn't cheer. We didn't even look at each other. I just reached for the incident log, turned the page, and left the previous one blank. Whatever had just happened wasn't going in the book, not yet. And that was before the captain's voice came on the line, too steady for someone who'd been missing. The captain's voice rolled through the speakers like it had been ironed flat. No urgency, no relief, just a perfectly measured cadence that didn't match the situation. I'd heard him on comms before. He was the type who let the salt water creep into his tone. Not tonight. Every word sounded like it had been rehearsed in a quiet room far from the Atlantic dot. We acknowledged the transmission, logged it, and the room moved on like we just solved a faulty wire. But nobody left. We stayed glued to our stations, waiting for anything that might explain the black hole we'd just come through. The captain gave his position, sea conditions, crew readiness. Each report landed with the precision of a hammer on a nail. The clock on the wall ticked past the 14-minute mark. I leaned back in my chair, headset resting around my neck, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system. It was louder now, or maybe the room had just gotten quieter. That's when I noticed my own breathing. Shallow, deliberate, matching the captain's pace without meaning to. The junior tech beside me kept glancing at his notes, crossing out lines before finishing them. His pencil scratched the paper like it was trying to leave before he could think too much. Across the room, one of the supervisors shifted in his seat, the leather creaking in a way that seemed to echo off the steel walls. It's strange how silence can take on a shape. In those minutes, it pressed down on us, not total absence of sound, but the kind that carries weight. I could hear my pulse in my ears. The teletype clattered once, then stopped, a strip of paper dangling like a tongue. Someone coughed. The captain kept talking. His final report was a formality. Routine drills completed. No incidents. Returning to standard watch. That last phrase, no incidents, landed like a lie told to a child. The kind you don't argue with, because the truth would be worse. The line went quiet, except for the faint carrier tone. We were still connected, but the ship wasn't saying anything else. I adjusted the gain, pushed the volume up just enough to catch the background. Nothing at first, then something. Faint, steady, metallic. Not banging, not scraping. More like breathing. Long mechanical inhalations, slow enough to make your skin crawl. I pulled off the headset and rubbed my eyes. When I put it back on, the sound was gone. The commander walked in again, scanning the room like he was counting us. His gaze paused on me. "You get all that?" "Yes, sir," I said, though I wasn't sure what that was. He nodded, left without another word. The junior tech leaned closer. "You hear it too?" His voice was low, almost lost under the hum. I didn't answer. In this line of work, sharing what you thought you heard was a good way to end up reassigned, or worse, promoted to a place where the questions got harder and the answers never came. We filed the report exactly as dictated, with every timestamp matching the official log. I slid my copy into the outgoing tray, the paper warm from my hand. And then, just as I reached for my coffee, the phone on the wall rang 3 short bursts. The code for a direct line from Central Command. The kind of call that doesn't wait for the truth to catch up. The line buzzed back to life like a ghost, waking from a long sleep. The captain's voice was calm, steady too steady. I'd worked with him before. I knew how to read a man's voice like a book. This was no tired sailor returning from a long watch. It was a script, delivered with the precision of a man reading a report he'd written himself. We weren't blind to the silence that had swallowed 14 minutes of time. But the crew? They acted like nothing had happened. No mentions of the blackout, no reports of lost signals or damage. Just the usual check-ins, the routine updates. It was like the submarine had stepped through a door into another reality and come back without missing a beat. Something in the voice caught my attention. A slight hesitation before the last line, a flicker of tension held tight under layers of control. The kind of tension you don't hear unless you're listening for it. And I was. That night, I sat back in my chair, replaying the transmissions over and over. Each phrase carefully crafted, every pause deliberate. It felt rehearsed, as if the captain had been coached in what to say, what to leave out. A script written to erase what really happened. The room smelled faintly of stale tobacco and solder. The usual suspects, the tired technicians, the watchful supervisors, were all glued to their stations, but their eyes flickered toward me, waiting for a sign, a reaction. I gave none. You ever smell fresh paint and think someone's hiding something? That was the atmosphere in the comms room, clean, too clean. Like a wall freshly covered, but you can still feel what's behind it. And then the orders came down. No written reports. Archive sealed. That should have been the end of it. But then the elevator door opened. The message arrived on a secure line, short, cold, and absolute. Archive sealed. No reports, no logs, no leaks. That was it. No explanations, no appeals to protocol or national security. Just an order that made it clear. What happened in those 14 minutes was not for the books. I sat alone in the dim light of my quarters, the receiver still warm in my hand. They never said why. They never said what we were hiding or who was watching. Just the quiet click of the line going dead, like a judge slamming down a gavel. Years of decoding secret channels taught me to read between the lines. This was a command that went beyond military discipline. It was a warning. Some truths don't just stay buried. They're locked away with guards who don't wear uniforms. I thought about the crew on that submarine. How many knew? How many looked away? And how many were sworn to forget? I remembered the captain's voice, perfectly practiced, carrying secrets heavier than any torpedo. They expected obedience. I gave them silence, but that silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions no one dared to ask aloud. And that's when the first envelope arrived. Days after the silence broke, I found myself walking the concrete pier under a sky so gray it felt like the ocean had risen to swallow the sun. The bastion was moored there, its hull slick with salt and shadows, looking as ordinary as any submarine resting after a patrol. But I knew better. What happened below the waves wasn't ordinary. Not by a long shot. They gave me a pretext, routine inspection, a chance to look closer without raising eyebrows. The officers at the dock didn't question my presence. They were used to visits, reports, hands poking into places better left alone. I kept my gaze sharp, scanning the darkened hatches, crew moving with practiced ease, their faces unreadable masks. I made my way to the torpedo compartment, the heart of any submarine's threat. The air was thick, a mix of metal, salt, and something else. Something I couldn't place at first. It wasn't the usual ocean brine or engine grease. It was heavier, industrial, almost chemical. It hung in the air like a warning. The compartment was dimly lit, lights flickering occasionally, casting long shadows on the racks where torpedoes rested. Among them, something caught my eye, a capsule, small and metallic, tucked away in a corner where the light barely reached. No markings, no identifiers, just cold, dull steel with a few dents, like it had been through hell and back. The sailors near it avoided looking directly at it, their eyes darting away whenever I glanced in that direction. One man shifted uneasily, fingers twitching like he wanted to say something, but swallowed the words instead. I got the message loud and clear. That capsule wasn't just cargo. It was a secret nobody wanted to talk about. I reached out to touch it, the metal cold and unyielding under my glove. The weight of it surprised me heavier than it looked, like it carried more than just physical mass. A presence. A message. My way back to the deck, I caught a whiff of something faint, fresh paint. New enough to smell, old enough to raise suspicion. The smell clung to the corners of the compartment, mixing with the salty air, a thin veil over whatever had transpired. Below, that night, I lay awake replaying the image of that capsule. It wasn't just a piece of hardware. It was the key to everything we hadn't been told. And I knew the real question wasn't what was inside it, but why it was there in the first place. The capsule sat in the shadows like it didn't belong. There, submarines carry all sorts of classified equipment, but this wasn't standard Navy issue. No serial numbers, no stenciled warnings, no paperwork waiting for a signature. Just bare, battered steel, the kind you'd expect to find in a scrapyard, not in the torpedo room of a U.S. nuclear sub. I'd seen contraband before, unmarked crates slipped in under the cover of supply runs. Unlisted weapons shipped to places they weren't supposed to be. This was different. The sailors working nearby handled the torpedoes with casual efficiency, but the space around that capsule felt like a no-go zone. No one touched it. No one even turned their back on it. I knelt beside it, resting my gloved hand on the surface. Cold, as if it had been stored in ice. The dents were shallow but deliberate, like it had been pried out of something that didn't want to let it go. I ran my fingers along the seam and found a faint groove just wide enough to suggest it opened, but with no visible latch or locking mechanism. "Need a hand, sir?" a young sailor asked from behind me. His voice was neutral, but his eyes kept flicking toward the capsule, then away. I told him no, and he nodded quickly, disappearing before I could ask anything else. There's a kind of tension you can't fake. It doesn't come from fear of being caught. It comes from knowing what happens if you are. The crew's body language was full of it. Tight shoulders, short answers. Every man seemed to be waiting for the same thing. The moment someone told them they could forget it ever existed. I checked the compartment's inventory list. Every item was accounted for, except there was no line item that could even loosely match the capsule. In the Navy, if it's not on paper, it's not supposed to exist. A faint vibration hummed through the deck plates beneath my boots. It wasn't the usual thrum of the reactor or the air circulation. This was sharper, more contained, like a generator starting and stopping in intervals. I glanced at the capsule again. The hum seemed to sync with it, as if the thing was alive in its own way. I stepped back, scanning the room for anything out of place. That's when I noticed the sailors' avoidance wasn't just habit, it was deliberate choreography. They moved around the capsule in wide arcs, never crossing in front of it, like they were following an unspoken rule drilled into them since docking. Back on deck, the captain was overseeing the offloading of standard munitions. His eyes slid over me without a word. It was the same look he'd given over the radio-controlled, precise, and hiding something. That evening, as I left the pier, I glanced back one last time. A group of dock workers in plain clothes wheeled a crate down the gangway. It was the right size, the right shape. The crate had no markings either. They loaded it into the back of a nondescript truck and drove off without so much as a log entry. Didn't follow. Not then. Sometimes the fastest way to get cut out of the loop is to look too interested. Still, as I walked back toward my quarters, I couldn't shake the thought. Whatever that capsule was, it hadn't been meant for storage. It had been meant for delivery, and somewhere between the ocean floor and that pier, it had found its way into the wrong hands, if it had ever been in the right ones to begin with. The mess hall on the bastion was quiet enough to hear the clink of utensils against tin trays. I chose a seat at the far end, where I could see the whole room without turning my head. My cover was simple: an inspector grabbing a late meal before heading ashore. The crew didn't question it. A sub's mess hall is where the truth usually slips out. Sailors talk more over bad coffee than in any debriefing. So I waited. A sub-officer with tired eyes and a week's worth of stubble sat across from me. I didn't ask about the capsule, not directly. Instead, I mentioned the torpedo. Room inspection. Let the silence hang just long enough. His spoon froze halfway to his mouth. Didn't see anything unusual, sir, he said flatly, eyes fixed on his bowl. That was the first red flag. I hadn't described anything. Yet he answered like he was reading from a script. I tested it again. Later, with another sailor in the corridor. Same response, almost word for word. No hesitation, no change in tone like the lines had been rehearsed and drilled into them by the fourth conversation. I realized it wasn't just avoidance, it was a pact. Someone high enough in the chain had ordered silence, and the crew had internalized it. Breaking that silence would cost them more than their careers. In my line of work, you learn to spot when a group is carrying the same unspoken truth. Signs were all here. Uniform denials, identical phrasing, the refusal to elaborate even when given the chance. They weren't just hiding the object, they were hiding their relationship to it. Later that night, in the narrow hallway outside the officers' quarters, I caught one of the younger sailors glancing over his shoulder before slipping into a room. A moment later, the sound of a latch turning echoed in the corridor. He was locking himself in. I didn't knock. Some doors you only open once, and I wasn't ready for what might come through. Back in my own quarters, I wrote down every denial I'd heard, every phrase that matched. The repetition wasn't accidental, it was conditioning. And conditioning like that doesn't happen over 14 minutes at sea. It's prepared. Long before the mission. That's when it clicked. The blackout, the capsule, the silence. They were all part of the same choreography. And somewhere in that chain of events, someone had decided I was allowed to see, just enough to keep me asking the wrong questions. But it wasn't the capsule that bothered me the most. It was the way those men avoided looking at each other whenever I mentioned it, like they were afraid the truth might be contagious. The records room in Norfolk wasn't glamorous rows of steel cabinets, the smell of paper, and a flicker from the overhead lights that no one ever bothered to fix. I'd been there enough times to know the layout by heart. I waited until the clerk stepped out for his smoke break. The door didn't have a guard. The real security was in the culture people trusted the logs because they believed no one would dare touch them. They were wrong. I pulled the bastion's maintenance file, thick enough to require both hands. Flipping through, everything was there. Routine checks, sonar calibrations, fuel reports. But when I reached the timestamp covering those 14 minutes, the pages jumped. One entry ended at 22:41, and the next began at 22:56. The paper between them was gone, torn out clean. No frayed edges, no trace in the binding. Whoever did it had tools, time, and permission. I checked the microfilm backup. Same gap. It wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate erasure. Even the paper log for the teletype printouts skipped those minutes entirely, the numbering adjusted, so no one would notice at first glance. Leaning over the cabinet, I thought about the crew's rehearsed denials. If the logs were gone, and the men said nothing, the truth had been boxed up twice, once in their heads, once in the files. Still, people make mistakes. I scanned the margins for stray pencil marks, faint indentations from a removed sheet. Near At bottom of the page before the gap, there it was a faint impression of 3 numbers. 472. Not a date, not a timestamp. Possibly a reference code. I copied it onto my palm before the clerk returned. He gave me the usual polite nod, oblivious. Back in my quarters, I tried matching the numbers against storage manifests, signal codes, even coordinates. Nothing. But I kept seeing them when I closed my eyes, etched into the paper like a scar. That night, I locked the scrap of paper with the numbers in my desk. I didn't know if it was a clue or a dead end. But I knew this. Pages don't vanish by accident. Not in our line of work. And when they do, it's because someone doesn't want you to read what came next. Or because someone knows you already have . It was raining the night I got the message. Not a storm, just the steady, soaking kind that makes a city feel smaller. I was walking back from the pier when a man in a navy coat passed me without breaking stride. He didn't look at me, didn't slow down, but his hand brushed mine, leaving a folded scrap of paper between my fingers. I didn't open it until I was inside my apartment. The handwriting was blocky, deliberate. We conocimos la pizza. No abras, no signature, no insignia, no return contact. But the phrasing, the tone, this wasn't American. It was Soviet, the kind of message that came from someone who had been told exactly what to say and what not to say. The fact they called it the piece told me 2 things. They knew it wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, and they knew it didn't belong here. I poured myself a drink and read it again. If they recognized it, that meant the capsule had a history, a purpose, maybe even a trail. But why warn me not to open it? The message wasn't a threat. It was a containment order. From them to me. And that was worse. The Soviets didn't hand out favors. If they were telling me to leave it alone, it meant one of 2 things. Either they were afraid of it, or they wanted me to think they were. I lit a cigarette and stared at the rain streaking down the window. Somewhere out there, in a dockside warehouse or the hold of another ship, that capsule was sitting in the dark. And the people who'd put it there had just confirmed they were watching me. I knew better than to respond directly. In this business, answering a message you're not supposed to have is as good as admitting you've read it. But I kept the paper tucked inside the lining of my jacket, not because I trusted the warning, but because I wanted to know why they thought I'd listen. Next morning, the capsule was gone from the bastion. Officially, it had never been there. And unofficially, it had just become my problem. The first crack came from a man I'd known for years, Lieutenant Harris. Quiet, disciplined, never the type to volunteer information, but always reliable when you needed him. He was on the bastion during the blackout. His name didn't appear in any of the amended logs, but he'd been assigned to watch the forward compartments that night. I caught him outside the base gym, still in uniform, wiping the rain off his cap. He looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep. The kind that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. When I asked about the capsule, his face didn't change, but his hands tightened around the strap of his bag. I wouldn't know about that, sir. Same rehearsed denial I'd heard from the others, except his voice cracked on, wouldn't. That crack was enough. Over the next week, I dug into his service record. Nothing unusual, commendations, spotless. Performance reviews, tours on other subs. But buried in the personnel transfer logs, I found a gap. 6 months unaccounted for between assignments, marked only as classified duty. That's the kind of entry that hides more than it reveals. A contact in naval intelligence owed me a favor. Over lukewarm coffee in a diner off base, he slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were grainy surveillance photos. Harris meeting with a civilian on a dock in the Azores. No uniform, no rank insignia. The civilian's face was half hidden, but the cut of his coat and the shape of his briefcase screened foreign service. The implication was clear. Harris had been in contact with someone outside the chain of command. And not just anyone, someone with the kind of reach to place an object like that capsule in the hold of a nuclear submarine. I kept digging, careful not to leave a trail. Eventually, I found the piece that made the rest click into place. A supply. Manifest from the Bastion's last patrol approved by Harris contained a sealed container listed as mechanical spare. No details, no serial. It had been signed onto the sub at sea, not at port. That meant one thing. There had been a rendezvous. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, Bastion had met another vessel, and Harris had overseen the transfer. The blackout wasn't an accident. It was cover. 14 minutes to bring something aboard, secure it, and prepare the crew for silence. And the worst part? I couldn't prove it without exposing myself. I closed the file and locked it away. Harris's record remained untarnished in the official archives. On paper, he was still the perfect officer, but I knew the truth. And I knew he delivered something the Soviets recognized. The only question left was whether they'd been the ones waiting for it, or whether we had. The summons came in the form of a plain envelope slid under my door. No name, no rank, no insignia, just a typed date, time, and room number. I knew better than to keep them waiting. The conference room was windowless, the air cold enough to make my knuckles ache. 3 men sat at the table, none in uniform. Civilian clothes, regulation haircuts, and faces I didn't recognize. They didn't ask me to sit. They told me, on the table, a single folder lay unopened. My name wasn't on it. The man in the middle gray suit, thin voice spoke first. "We're here to close this matter. Permanently." They laid it out with the precision of a surgeon, removing a tumor. Every note I'd taken, every observation, every name connected to those 14 minutes, it all had to go. I was to sign an acta de destruction, confirming that no evidence remained in my possession. Refusal wasn't on the table. I signed, slowly. The pen scratched across the paper like it didn't want to be part of this. One of the men slid the signed sheet into the folder, snapped it shut, and stood. "This never happened," he said. "Not a request, not a threat. Just a fact." As they left, one of them paused at the door. "For your own sake, don't think about it again. But you don't. Just switch off a memory, especially one that comes with the smell of cold steel and the weight of something you can't name pressing down on you." Back in my quarters, I burned the last scrap of paper I'd kept, the one with the numbers from the logbook. I watched the edges curl and blacken until they crumbled into ash. The message, the capsule, Harris, they all went into the same mental drawer. Locked, unmarked, but never empty. The official record said the Bastion's patrol was uneventful. That was this story. That was the truth they wanted. And from that day forward, it was the truth I told everywhere except in my own head. Until the day something made me open that drawer again. It had been years since I'd last seen the Bastion, but the memory of that capsule still lived in the back of my mind, like a splinter you can't dig out. I'd done what they asked, signed the papers, destroyed the notes, let the official version stand unchallenged. Life moved on, at least on paper. Then one winter morning, a package arrived. No return address, no postage. Just a battered cardboard box left outside my door. Inside was a single item wrapped in oilcloth. When I peeled it back, I froze. It wasn't the capsule, but it was close enough. Same unmarked steel, same faint groove along the seam. Lighter than I remembered, almost empty. A small card was taped to the side. 4 words, typed on the same kind of machine the Soviets favored in the 70s. It was never ours. I sat with it on the table for hours, turning it over in my hands. Whatever was inside had been removed long ago, but the weight I felt wasn't. Physical, it was the reminder that I'd been part of a delivery whose real destination had nothing to do with the Navy, the Soviets, or the Cold War. It was meant for me, and I still don't know why. I keep the oilcloth-wrapped shell in the bottom drawer of my desk, not hidden just there, under a stack of meaningless files, waiting. Some nights, I take it out and set it in the middle of the table, listening to the apartment settle around me. No ticking, no hum, no secrets leaking out. Just the quiet presence of something that once carried a truth I'll never see. The men who ordered my silence are probably gone now, buried under stones with dates that don't tell their real stories. Harris? I haven't heard his name in decades. The Bastion is long decommissioned, cut into pieces somewhere far from any map. But the capsule, this one, or the one I saw that night, still exists somewhere. And if it ever comes back to me whole, I'm not sure I'd open it. Sometimes, not knowing is the only way to sleep. You stayed until the last word. So now you know more than you should. If you want the rest, you'll have to come looking for it, not leave a trace in the comments. Just enough for me to find you.